So to learn more about education in America today, please welcome Sarah Morris, who will introduce our featured speaker, Kati Haycock. Sarah.
Please welcome Kati Haycock.
Actually, the honor is mine, Sarah. The work that Sarah is doing here in Seattle, and most particularly this new Our Schools Coalition, is something that my team admires greatly and is excited to watch in the years ahead. So back in 1983, as many of you may remember, we got our first wake-up call as a country from a National Commission on Excellence in Education that told us in quite stark language about the rising tide of mediocrity in our schools, and said quite simply that if a foreign nation had done this to us, we would have considered it an act of war. Now, as those of you who were around at the time may remember, at that moment, the nation's governors and legislators scurried to respond. And all across the country, there was a flurry of reform activity. And most observers at that time urged them to move fast, arguing that the window of opportunity for passing major reforms would quickly close as public attention shifted away from education to something else. Well, the truth is, it is more than 25 years later, and public attention has not shifted. And the reason for that, I think you all know, is really quite simple. The demands of our economy, not to mention of simply living in this democracy, have escalated very fast. And the pace of change in education results is simply not keeping up. The result, quite simply, is that even our top-performing kids are not doing nearly as well as top-performing kids in other countries, and the problem is much more severe at the other end. Large numbers of our young people have nowhere near the skills that they need either to enter post-secondary education or to get a decent job. So, desperate to get faster improvement, leaders in some states around the country have really indulged lately in lots of pretty heated rhetoric. And the response from education organizations has been equally heated. What I'm hoping to do in the short time we have together is take that heat down a few notches and do essentially three things. One, to give you the best quick briefing on kind of where we're at, what the achievement trends look like, kindergarten through college. Second, to help you understand why there's so much focus right now on teacher quality and why evaluating our teachers against high standards is actually profoundly pro-teacher, not anti-teacher. But I also want to remind you, in talking about teachers, of what you also undoubtedly know from your own work. And that is, like professionals in other fields, even the very best teachers can be totally undermined by ineffective managers and dysfunctional systems. What that means is that we got to hold two ideas in our heads at the same time. The idea that good teaching matters and we need to act on that knowledge, but the idea that good systems matter too. So let me shift to the briefing part first. So when you look at results on national examinations, the trends are really pretty clear. At the elementary level, we are seeing quite heartening improvements. We're seeing improvements in both reading and in mathematics. They're somewhat stronger in mathematics, and they are stronger for low-income kids and kids of color than they are for other children, which means, and this is good, that the gaps between groups are smaller today than they've ever been. Certainly, the pace of change has not been as fast as we would like it to, and if I could show you the graphs, you'd see they're moving up, but not as fast as you would wish. But the bottom line is, at the elementary level, we have pretty good traction on our improvement efforts. The same, unfortunately, cannot be said of results in our high schools. Whether you're looking at reading, where results today are actually weaker for our graduates than they were 25 years ago, or mathematics, where they're a tiny bit better, but not nearly as much as you would expect. And unfortunately, the gap there between poor kids and middle-class kids and kids of color and white kids is actually wider today at the end of high school than it was back in 1990. And frankly, no matter how you cut the international data, there's not much there to write home about. Our kids clearly are not doing nearly as well at the secondary level as their counterparts in other developed countries. Whether you're looking at reading results, at math and science results, or at problem solving, our rank tends to be in the mid-20s or low 30s, not exactly, in other words, the place that Americans want to be or, frankly, are used to being. Now, the truth of the matter is when you we used to make up for that kind of mediocre performance at the K-12 level by simply sending more of our kids to college than did anybody else. But even there, as at least some of you know, our lead has fallen away. If you look at our overall adult workforce, we still rank relatively high, about 4th in the developed world in terms of the proportion of our adult population that has an associate's degree or better. But when you look at our young adults, that ranking falls to 10th in the developed world. And I think most worrisome all, we are one of only 2 countries in the entire developed world where today's young people are no longer better educated than their parents. And as I suspect all of you know, this is the first generation in American history where that's been true, where, in other words, parents couldn't, through the hard work of their own labors, help to make sure that their children were better educated than they were. And that, unfortunately, is no longer true. Now, where does Washington State fit in this mix? When you look at the elementary and secondary numbers, pretty much dead in the center. A little bit better than average in math, a little bit lower than average in reading, but bottom line is you're pretty much in the middle of a country that is itself the lower middle. Not a good place to be. And when you look at the higher ed numbers, much worse than that. You are 5th from the bottom among all states in the proportion of your high school seniors who enter college the following year. And when you look at the number of 9th graders who actually graduate from high school and go on to college, you are also 5th from the bottom. Again, not a good place to be. So that's where we are. The question, of course, that's most important is how do we dig our way out of that situation? Now, the reality is that most experts agree you can't just do one thing, and that obviously won't surprise you. We need to start with much higher standards for what we expect of our kids, and those standards need to be similar to those in other developed countries. We need much better assessments, not the dumbed-down ones that our teachers hate teaching to and our kids hate being taught to, but much richer examples that look at much higher level skills. And we need, as Sarah said, accountability systems that actually demand progress from our schools, that actually demand continuous improvement, just as happens in the rest of the economy. But the data are also clear that as we do those things, we also have to get much more serious than we have before in this country about the quality of our teacher force. So why is that important? Well, over the last 15 years, we've developed a lot of new methods that actually make it much more easily possible for us to look at the differences amongst our teachers in their ability to take kids from wherever they are when they enter a year and actually grow their academic skills. So we're not looking at end-of-the-year test scores. What we're actually looking at is how much do children grow during the year when they're with a particular teacher. And what you find out when you dig into those data is there are whopping differences amongst our teachers in their ability to grow kids. Now, those of you who are parents probably knew this from experience, but the reality is in the policy world, we just pretend that that's not true. Well, it is. In fact, those differences are so profound that in the course of just 1 year, with a particularly effective teacher, a child will grow, as much as a year and a quarter, even a year and a half's worth of learning in just a single year. And unfortunately, in the child with an ineffective teacher may grow the equivalent of half a year or a quarter of a year or even less. So there are big differences amongst our teachers, and those differences accumulate over the years. Kids who have 3 strong teachers in a row literally soar, no matter what their family circumstances are, or kids who have even 2 weak teachers in a row literally never recover. So teachers matter hugely, and there are big differences among them. The problem is we pretend that there aren't, right? So when it comes to evaluating our teachers every year, we pretty much tell them they're all the same. When it comes to compensating them, we advance their salaries based on years of experience and sometimes college credits, but we pay the very best ones exactly the same otherwise that we pay the very worst ones. And perhaps worst of all, no matter how good or how bad you are, if you are still standing at the end of 3 years, we give you a job for life. We give you tenure. None of those things make sense given these big differences. Now, policymakers are especially focused on the evaluation part right now, arguing that it's really important to set very clear standards for what good teaching looks like and to make sure that our teachers are evaluated against those standards, and to make especially sure that one of the most important things that we look at when we're giving teachers their annual evaluation is that growth thing, right? How much do your kids grow? That, after all, is the fundamental responsibility of a teacher. So we're arguing if that's your fundamental responsibility, that's what we ought to be looking at. Now, there are, as those of you who read the papers know, some teachers who argue that that's unfair, right? That it's unfair to hold them responsible for how much kids grow, arguing that there are all kinds of other things that get in the way. But the fact of the matter is that, as other teachers know, we actually have ways to take account for those things right now. And what we're really doing is we've developed these techniques that actually show how much your children grow compared to the children who are just like them, right? So it's a very fair measure of looking at how much people grow. And lots of other teachers actually are welcoming this effort to do that. Why is that? Number one, because they're tired of making up every year for the teacher who had the kids the year before and didn't do anything with them. And number two, because high performers actually need the challenge of getting better, right? They want to be evaluated against clear standards. They want to know where they don't measure up. They want some help to get better. And when you evaluate all people the same, you don't get any of that. So it's really important that we move forward in this in a responsible way, because not doing so does huge damage. It does huge damage both to the profession of teaching. It says anybody can do it when we know that's not true. But it also does huge damage to children, especially to the kids who are most likely to be assigned to our least effective teachers, and that is poor kids and kids of color. So we've got to act on this. To me, it's a sort of no-brainer. But, and let me be clear about this, and again, agreeing that teachers matter, right, and that there are differences among them does not mean that there are no other things that matter. You know, one of the things that happens in education policy is this huge pendulum swings back and forth. So we decide on what the new thing is, and we rush madly after it as if that were the only thing that mattered, and we forget everything else. And then, of course, when that thing turns out to be what we knew it was, not the only thing that mattered, then we give up on that and fling back to some other thing. Let's not do that this time, right? Let's say, yes, in fact, teachers matter, and it is hugely important to act on that knowledge. But that doesn't mean we should throw out all the other ideas in our heads, the other knowledge in our head about what matters too. What matters, right? School leadership matters hugely. You all know from work you do in the sectors you work in that that good managers, good leaders who know how to bring others along are hugely important. Yet we're not talking about that in the current reform conversation. We're talking only about teachers. We've got to get serious about school leadership too, because that matters hugely, especially to our best teachers. But so too do the dysfunctional systems that don't provide the kind of support that teachers need to get better. And among the most serious of those dysfunctions is simply this. Most of our teachers today, including people who are brand new to the profession, right, who have no previous experience, get actually very little, if any, direction at all on what they should be teaching or how. What do? New teacher walks in the door, we hand them a copy of these very vague things states call standards. We hand them a textbook and we say, go teach. No other developed country does that. In every other developed country, there are rich curriculum materials, right? Teachers don't have to work hard all day, go home at night and correct homework, and then at 3 a.m. try to make up a lesson they're going to teach the next day. They can draw on rich curriculum materials designed by the very best teachers to help others to learn what good teaching looks like, and in particular what good student work looks like. So yes, teachers matter, and we got to work on that, but we've also got to work on these other system things too. Now, I know most of you are sitting there going, duh, that's kind of just common sense. And it is, in fact, common sense. But the reality is that in most state capitals and in many local leadership groups, there's not so much common sense to go around. That's where you all come in. Because one of the things we know from long experience is that policymakers very often, and this includes both local folks and state folks, are very typical to just take on one piece of it, declare victory, and then go home. The only thing that stops them from doing that is when there are citizens who have organized to keep the pressure on, to make sure they do the whole job, not just part of it. Now, Sarah and her group are doing that here in Seattle. Mary Jean Ryan and her new Community Center for Education Results is working with community organizations elsewhere, especially in the south part of this area. And Chris Korsmos and the fabulous League of Education Voters are working statewide to bring that kind of pressure for common sense solutions to bear here as well. If you are not involved with these folks, you should be, because that's the most important thing you can do to make sure that your state acts on what educators know will work and move things ahead. For a city and a community and a state that is set out to eradicate malaria and meningitis, not simultaneously agree to set a priority on eradicating underachievement here in Washington would be insane. You could do that if you set your minds to it. I hope you will. Thank you very much.
Katie does have time for some questions. Does anybody? I thought I'd see some hands go up. A number of people. And again, look for the folks with the mic, get their attention, and we'll rotate back and forth between the two. Susie has it. Somebody.
You mentioned measurement of change over a year.
Yes.
What are some of those measures? How do we do that, and how can we help to make that happen?
Sure. So there are basically a couple of ways that people are doing it. One, using state assessments and a technique called value added. What's happening is they look at where students are at the beginning of the year and look at how much they grow over the course of that year. Generally speaking, there's some statistical methodology that actually creates a trajectory, and you look at what trajectory the child is on and then compare what happened that year to that. But the bottom line is what you see is even teachers who are teaching side by side in the same school, One of them produces huge growth every year, year after year after year. Another one produces very small growth. So that's called value added, and it's considered probably one of the best and most objective ways, especially if you have multiple years of data on individual teachers. Second, though, lots of districts are beginning and states are beginning to craft additional ways to look. So, for example, you may look at samples of student writing at the beginning of an academic year, and then look at samples of student writing at the end of the academic year, and then evaluate how much better did the writing get during that year, compare that growth to what happened in other classrooms serving similar kids. So it's really about a combination of looking at assessment results and how the growth looks over time, and looking at actual projects or work students are doing and seeing how that gets better over time. But again, the bottom line is you're not just looking at end of the year results. What teachers have always said is, don't just look at end of the year results, because that doesn't take into account where the kids were in the beginning. And it actually penalizes me if I'm willing to take on kids who really come in low, and you don't want to do that. So what this does really is just concentrate on how much did the kids grow.
President Stan, I have 5 questioners already lined up. So,
And I have 2. The first is a quick question.
Sure.
Where does No Child Left Behind fit in all this? And the second question is, we've chosen in this country to administrate our schools on the local basis. And so you have a diffusion then of responsibility, and I'm not sure how many school districts we have in Washington State, but it's more than 35.
It's 200 and something, I believe. Yeah. Yeah. Where does No Child Left Behind sit? Both the Senate and the House are gearing up for the 3rd time now to what's called reauthorize that law. That is, to decide what the new law should look like. It is possible that they'll finish before election year craziness sets in, but I would not bet my life on it. So I think it is quite possible, probably probable, that we will live with that law for another 2 years. There's a good side to that. I think most educators and community folks would agree that the focus that the law has put on looking not just at averages in schools, but really making educators who've been reluctant to do this look specifically at how are their poor kids doing, how are their English language learners doing, and so on. There's no question, but that focus has really helped us to accelerate improvements for some kids. But it is equally clear that some of the laws, prescriptions were far too rigid. And so I think the question is, how will we get the balance right next time? What's the right balance of sort of stretch goals, but some flexibility on how we respond? And Congress will be trying to do that now. It's going to be tough. There's so many new members of the committees, most of them elected to abolish the Department of Education, so it's making our job of educating them a little bit challenging right now, but we're working on it. We'll see. And you're right to put your finger on, there's a terrible tension around, we are in fact a country, right? And if one state doesn't step up to its responsibilities to educate its kids well, it not only hurts those children and that state, but it actually hurts us as a country. So how to get this right, how to have a strong federal vision, right, and how to help the federal government play its federal government's historic role, which is really about watching out for the kids who are likely to get kind of run by in state efforts. Is a tricky question, but I think in part because there's such strong leadership at the state level in moving toward these new common standards, we've got something to build on now. We've got almost every state agreeing to sign on to the same standards, right? The same assessments, so we'll finally have kind of honest information looking across states at how folks are doing. And the good part of that is then you can really see who's going to the races here, who's really getting it done, and what are they doing, whereas with the current system, it's much harder to do that kind of learning.
One important factor I don't think you mentioned is the number of quality hours in the classroom. And I think most of the competitive countries we compete with through the K through 12, their kids, when they graduate, have had effectively 2 years or so extra in the classroom.
Yes.
The other factor is the enormous flood of substitute teachers that we have going into the classroom. No matter how good they might be, it has to be disruptive.
You are certainly right about instructional hours. We are short of those in some countries, although certainly not in all countries. In fact, some of the countries that outperform us don't even start their kids in school till age 8. So we're lower than some, but certainly not all. And if the question is, would it help if we had either a longer school year or a longer school day? Would we be able, by using that time well, to get more of our kids to higher levels of achievement? I think so. It's also, though, a very expensive strategy, and one we're not likely to be embracing in the next couple of years as states are kind of reeling under their budgets. So the reason I didn't mention it, it's not really possible to get much traction on that in the short term. As for the substitute issue, I don't know the data here. I can tell you in most parts of the country, there's been a real decline in the use of substitutes. And so we're not nearly seeing as many instructional hours taught by subs as we perhaps used to. But if you're asking, is it a problem when you do? And is it especially a problem when you have kids who are taught by a sequence of long-term subs because their schools didn't hire somebody to be there the whole year? That's a real problem. No question about it.
President Stan?
Well, thank you for coming. I'm past chair of the Alliance for Education, and what I really wanted to emphasize, and I know Sarah would like to hear more about this too, this morning in our newspaper, we had reported Patty Murray's new act called the Learn Act on Literacy, where she's going to propose to Congress a $12 billion over 5-year program to promote literacy in our public schools throughout the country. Given the fact that you talked about the children outside of elementary and in middle school and in high school, and where this act theoretically would put 60% of the money in middle and high school to promote college, what's your take on this particular piece of legislation?
I don't know all the details of it, but if the question is, could our teachers use help, especially at the secondary level, in improving their knowledge about how to teach, for example, reading in the content area, which is actually something that teachers in other countries actually learn in their teacher preparation programs, but we don't do here. So if you're asking, would it help if we had dollars to actually help them to master those skills and to improve literacy levels in our students? Absolutely. Is it likely in this environment? Anything that costs is going to be a stretch. So I think one of the questions will be with bills like Senator Murray's, right? Legislators are kind of putting their markers out there. She's on the committee, right, as a part of an effort to then pull things together into the overall Elementary and Secondary Act. These things don't pass independently. They get folded into an act. So I think the question will be, can we keep that focus, get some extra resources behind it, and push it into the Elementary and Secondary Act? I hope we can, because there is no question when you talk to teachers, they are really struggling with, especially with teaching reading in the content areas.
President?
I was really disappointed to hear that we ranked 5th from the bottom, you said, in Washington.
Yes.
And astounded to hear that 1/3 of our people don't graduate from high school. And I'm wondering if there are also some societal issues that are in play here, rather than saying all of the responsibility is the teachers. Shouldn't parents be accepting more responsibility? I mean, I look at my own grandkids that, with some encouragement early, know how to read when they're not even in school yet. And I'm wondering whether more responsibility ought to be put on the parents.
It's a good question. I'm glad you asked it. Let me try to answer it this way. I mean, this is a subject we could spend a lot of time on, and we don't have a lot of time. there is no question but what the job is easier for schools when parents do their part, right? And the smartest schools and communities really organize to help parents do that. And they acknowledge that for some parents this is more of a stretch than for others, whether it's because of language issues or poverty or their own low levels of education, it's a stretch. That said, what we know is that even the poorest parents with the least education actually can become important partners in their children's education when we acknowledge that and invite them into the process. So that's really, really important. But let me be clear about something too. One of the things that we have learned is that though these things going outside of schools matter, and they do in fact make things more challenging for some schools than others, that schools that are really organized to get not just some of their children, but all of their children to high levels of achievement, and that stop at nothing to get that done, absolutely can get there for even the poorest children. So when parents can't or won't be or aren't as involved, yes, we ought to work on that, but it can never become an excuse for us not to do our part. And our part, it turns out, is very powerful. In fact, one of the things that always worries me when I come to the state of Washington is that all too often I hear too much like my own home state of California, which has for years been look at this incredible, wonderful diversity of kids. When I look at the kids here, I see this incredible, wonderful array of kids, but instead of looking at that as an asset, especially in this globalized, internationalized world, we see them as burdens, right? We say, oh, look at their problem, look at their families, right? They're messed up, they really can't do this. And I can tell you, when we look at the data in schools, in districts, in states that don't see them as a burden, do see them as an asset and organize accordingly, they really roar. They get kids to high levels of achievement. And you guys could do that too.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions.
So I was just in D.C. last week, and we got to meet with the Undersecretary of Education. One of the things he floated was that high-quality teachers in larger classroom settings still produce an optimum outcome compared to multiple mediocre teachers in smaller classroom settings. Can you comment on that?
I think you kind of said it, right? In fact, I saw in my email this morning, Brookings has just released a kind of overview of the research on class size. So here's what we know. If you hold everything constant, and everything means in particular teacher quality, if you can reduce class size, especially at the lowest grade levels, significantly, and that means 7 or 8, at least by 7 or 8 kids, and you can produce better results, especially for low-income kids. But that if you're not holding teacher quality high and are in fact doing what I would call the California approach, which is reduce class size and let anybody teach, it's a terrible, terrible response, right? So great teachers are very, very little affected by class size, right? So if you're going to choose which route to go, spend your money on great teachers. Don't worry so much about class size. It doesn't mean in the lower grade levels that it doesn't help, but the most important thing is teacher quality.
What couple of states would you say are most effective in this area? That's one question. The second one is, what part does funding play in all of this?
Okay. If you ask the question kind of which states have improved the most, and I think that's really the most important question, and have narrowed their gaps the most, which is another very important question for a state like this one, they would be probably Florida, Delaware, Massachusetts. Texas was a strong leader, as was North Carolina. That's kind of plateaued a bit. Still quite strong in math in Texas, less strong in reading. But those are the places from which we think the most powerful lessons come. On the dollar issue, I mean, this is another place where I think common sense is probably as useful as the research. Common sense tells you that if you have more resources and spend them wisely, you can, in fact, improve results faster. And most folks I talk to in the corporate world say, you know, when they're going through a big change, when they're trying, in particular, they've got the equivalent of our new standards, right? You invest a lot in retraining your people, and those things cost money. It also costs money to take the kids who are coming in way behind and give them the extra instruction they need. So some of this costs money. But it's not just about money, right? It really is about how those dollars are spent. I mean, I can take you to districts. Newark is a very good example, $20,000 a year per kid. The results are very sad. So it really is, it's about dollars if you're considering how they're used. I mean, that really matters.
Thank you very much.
One more.
Thank you, Katie. That was terrific.
Seattle Rotary Online is made possible in part by a grant from First Choice Health, working with the Washington Health Information Collaborative to use technology to bring better health care to patients throughout the Pacific Northwest. First Choice Health.